Hey everyone. Today, resource team is going to be giving a presentation on obsessive compulsive disorder, or what we all might know a little better as OCD.
All right, and to begin, let's talk about the clinical definition of OCD. So, OCD is a disorder comprised of obsessions and or compulsions. While most individuals with OCD experience both of these things, one can be diagnosed with OCD if they have just compulsions or just obsessions. Obsessions are recurrent, intrusive thoughts that can have a degree of irrationality. So these may be unwanted thoughts, images, or urges that the individual can't really control or explain. And usually this results in the individual experiencing a great deal of anxiety and distress. And some common obsessions you may have heard of are usually driven out of fear of some outcome, like fear of contamination, or if they're obsessed over their safety, they may fear harm. Another well-known example that is associated with OCD, usually seen in our popular culture and media, is this need for order or symmetry. So this fixation on a specific type of organization or perfectionism. And this can get kind of complicated because of the way we utilize terms like perfectionist in our modern day language, but more often because we misuse the term OCD. And we'll get into that in some later slides. Now, compulsions, these are repetitive actions that one takes to help eliminate or resist the obsessions. These compulsive behaviors are often driven by the individual's obsession, and they're performed to grant them some sort of temporary relief from the symptoms of anxiety and distress they're experiencing. For example, we mentioned that one might have an obsession concerning cleanliness and contamination. So, this fear of contamination can introduce some recurrent intrusive thoughts or images. The individual may feel that their surroundings are not clean, and they might feel a great deal of anxiety and distress over this. So, a compulsive behavior they could develop in attempts to eliminate their anxiety is excessive hand washing. They might be a compulsive hand washer, and usually these compulsions are uncontrollable. And I think we've all kind of heard or read about individuals with this hand washing compulsion. They like wash their hands to the point that they're even raw or bleeding. Other examples of common compulsions include this idea of checking and repeating. So these are usually driven out of that obsession over safety and perhaps fearing a outcome that could cause the individual harm. So, an individual who is experiencing anxiety and distress and obsessing over the safety of their house, for example, they might check that the stove is off, go to shut their windows, turn off all their lights, unplug all their appliances, and usually this once around is not enough. And these actions suddenly become repetitive. So they go back to the stove, go back to their windows, check everything again, usually multiple times, and maybe, just maybe, that provides them some temporary relief. And there's also a common concept of these compulsive behaviors occurring in those multiples. So the individual might have a very specific number that they deem as quote unquote good or safe, and they perform these compulsive behaviors that many times. It's also been noted in some cases that as the individual's symptoms progress and the severity of their OCD increases, these multiples can get larger and larger. So if they used to check the stove was off exactly 5 times before they left their house, it's possible for that number to increase to 7 or 9, etc., as their OCD worsens. And that kind of covers the general features we see with OCD, but of course, there are also diagnostic criteria. So, per DSM 5, OCD is distinctly different from anxiety disorder and is grouped with other disorders, also known as obsessive compulsive related disorders. And just because they share certain features, and we'll talk about that a little more too. So, the criteria to be met for an OCD diagnosis include the individual presenting with obsessions, compulsions, or both, and that these obsessions and compulsions do cause the individual distress in some way. These recurrent obsessions and compulsions do need to be time consuming, taking up more than 1 hour of the person's day, and the distress resulting from the person's obsessions and compulsive behaviors must prove to be interfering with their life in some way, whether it's socially or through their professional or occupational life. In addition, the symptoms they are experiencing should not be caused by extraneous sources. For example, any use of substances should not be the main cause of their symptoms, and their symptoms and behaviors should not be better explained by another disorder as well. And as mentioned, per the DSM 5, there are some disorders that share some common characteristics with OCD. And they're usually grouped with OCD. They are referred to as obsessive compulsive related disorders, or sometimes called OC spectrum disorders. Examples include body dysmorphic disorder, where the person can have an obsessive preoccupation with the flaws in their physical appearance. This can lead to repetitive compulsive behaviors that concern their appearance. So they might check their reflection multiple times or repeatedly change outfits. There is also hoarding disorder, which many of us know about. This obsession and difficulty to part with or discard one's items and possessions, and usually if forced to, they experience a great level of distress over the situation. Excoriation, that is the recurrent and compulsive skin picking disorder, and trichotillomania, the recurrent and compulsive hair pulling disorder. And in addition, there are disorders, not OC spectrum disorders, but other disorders that can be confused with OCD because of the similar and overlapping characteristics. So some examples, anxiety disorder. As we know, marked anxiety to be a symptom of OCD, but often in OCD, there's that degree of irrationality to the anxiety that is not really characteristic of a generalized anxiety disorder. OCD and autism spectrum disorders may also be confused with one another. An individual living with an autism spectrum disorder can have repetition focused thoughts and some behaviors like an individual with OCD. However, the individual with OCD is usually focused on trying to prevent these repetitive thoughts because they very much dislike this obsession. And usually that's the reason for the resulting compulsions as well. And this can be a very significant component for their OCD diagnosis. But an individual with an autism spectrum disorder usually is not too focused on trying to stop these thoughts from occurring. It feels very natural, one could say. And of course, there are more characteristics that can be seen with autism spectrum disorders that are not usually seen in OCD. Even tic disorders like Tourette syndrome, they can be confused with OCD because of the repetitive nature of the person's tics. But it's more common for an individual with OCD to develop these tics in response to their recurrent intrusive thoughts and obsessions. So, just a takeaway here, there is always going to be potential for misdiagnosis, and many features are seen in OCD that are seen in other disorders as well, but these disorders can be distinguished from one another by a well-trained mental health professional.
So, the lifetime prevalence of OCD is about 2.3%. This percentage has been changing throughout the years, but that is the percentage that was found in 2003, where this graph is showing. And also, there have also been mixed findings in the gender differences in OCD diagnosis. And so, um, the prevalence in specific genders is still under study currently, and there may or may not be a gender difference. Additionally, the onset of OCD is typically from your childhood to your 30s and will typically lead a chronic course. And so, by that, um, OCD has great high severity in more than 50% of OCD diagnoses. And so, if a person does have OCD, it's likely that they have a pretty severe version of OCD. And so the graph on the right just shows the prevalence from 2001 and 2003. And in this year, they found that females had a higher percentage of prevalence in OCD rather than males, but future studies after 2003 have really been showing varying levels of female and male gender diagnoses. And so that's just something to keep in mind is that um, when we think about these prevalence graphs, take it with a grain of salt in that all the data might not be there due to a lack of research in mental illness disorders. And like Ali mentioned before, there's also much chance for misdiagnoses too. So I wanted to mention this sort of pioneering study of OCD, and um, it was done by Rachman and Desilva in 1978. And so just to preface with this study, it's important to note that during this time there was a lack of knowledge about OCD, and given that it was in 1978, this was using the DSM-2, I believe, and the DSM-2. We're currently in the DSM-5, and so um, the data in this study, although very important to note, also is not super updated with our OCD current diagnoses, and so um, it was just to preface with that, there's a little bit of uncertainty with the study. So for this study, we had two different studies and sort of subsections of each. And so for the first study, there was participants that were 124 non-OCD people. And so what they were trying to figure out here was that do non-OCD people experience normal or abnormal obsessions that are akin to an OCD diagnosis? And so what they found here was that 104 out of the 124 reported having those intrusive thoughts and images, even though they did not have an OCD diagnosis. Um, and so the table on the right here with the stars, I wanted to mention these data that was collected from this study because the main difference from OCD versus non-OCD people is that the intrusive thoughts and images that they experienced were easily dismissible. And so, given by the higher numbers in the easily dismissible column, this is a large distinction that was found at the time with non-OCD and OCD people. And additionally, it's also important to note that there are different definitions of normal and abnormal. And at the time, there was a little bit of convoluted evidence in like what was considered an obsession and what was considered a non-obsession, just an irrational thought. And so um, that's just to keep in mind with the study. Next slide, please. And then the second part of the study was discovering if there were similarities and differences between obsessions from non-OCD individuals and OCD individuals. And so in this study, they used 40 people from the previous sub-study. So out of those 124 from the previous, they took 40 of those who identified with those intrusive thoughts but were dismissible. And then they also used 8 subjects who were clinically diagnosed with OCD. And what they did here was to collect the obsession descriptions. And so, for example, someone would say, "Oh, I have impulsive thoughts when I look at my dog," or something like that. And so, all these obsessions were collected from the subjects and written down on slips of paper, scrambled, and then given to psychologists and other mental health specialists to decipher between whether individuals were non OCD versus OCD. And what they found was that there were actually no definable differences, and the clinicians that were doing this sorting had a hard time with distinguishing between non OCD and OCD. And so um, it was concluded from this study that everyone really has all these irrational thoughts, but the difference is between a person with OCD and a person without OCD is that our ability to control these thoughts. And so I just wanted to show from the study, these are a couple examples of the impulses and thoughts that they collected. And so these are just a couple examples with on the left with those that were non-clinically diagnosed with OCD, and then on the right, they were clinically diagnosed. So, as you can see, there are some similarities between the thoughts and impulses, and so that was the case with the conclusion of the study. And so, um, going off of that, next slide, please. Going off of that, based on that study's results, that everyone has irrational thoughts, but being able to control them is what sets aside a person with OCD and not OCD. Those are kind of how our treatments are based up upon. And so, first we have medication, which is just the use of SSRIs and other antidepressants. And then with our therapies, we really focus on being able to control these thoughts and um, so what that can look like is with cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure and response prevention, imaginal exposure, and habit reversal training. And so these exposure therapies really help the person understand that their intrusive thoughts can be controlled and help them find coping mechanisms that are healthy to control for these impulsive thoughts. And so that is sort of emphasized in the treatment of OCD.
Yeah, and so for the next couple slides, we just wanted to give you guys some kind of scenarios to illustrate more concretely this difference between OCD clinically and just being organized, or the way that a lot of people refer to OCD in our popular culture, in a non-clinical sense. So our first individual will be John. John is a dedicated musician who works hard to practice his music over and over until perfection. And Jackson, on the other hand, is also a dedicated musician who practices songs over and over until perfection. However, his practice sessions need to start and end in prime numbered hours, and if he misses the hour mark by even a minute, he has to keep practicing until the next prime numbered hour, or he stresses about it for the rest of the day. So, John, in our scenario, is an individual without OCD, and Jackson is an individual with OCD. And our team just wanted to kind of uh, ask you guys what you see in the difference between John and Jackson and how they are approaching their music and practicing, and what distinguishes the two of them.
For Jackson, um, not fitting a specific routine when he practices affects his everyday life, as in it stresses him out, or he won't be able to finish practicing, therefore making him unable to do other tasks within his life freely without being bothered.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely a key difference in the way that Jackson's maybe obsession here with this right number, like Ali was talking about, if he doesn't fulfill that or relieve that anxiety of, not making that prime numbered hour, then it's really affecting his day. And as Ali was talking about, kind of the DSM definition, if you think about like if Jackson starts at 5, or Jackson wants to end his practice at 5 and he gets to 5:01, now he has to practice for another 2 hours. So obviously that's taking up quite a good chunk of his time, especially if he has other things to do. Our second scenario, this is our last one, is going to compare Sarah and Sophia. So another really common idea of OCD in our popular culture is the idea of a neat freak. So Sarah considers herself a neat freak, and she likes to keep her workspace tidy and clean. She gets satisfaction out of having her pens in a color coordinated order and making her desk squeaky clean. Sophia, on the other hand, well, she's also called a neat freak by her coworkers. She meticulously cleans her desk 5 times a day because she's scared of catching a disease and spreading it to her family. Sometimes she misses lunch or skips meetings to keep cleaning. When she submits work to her boss, she often emails him the attachment 5 times and keeps checking to make sure it hasn't disappeared. She knows that doing these things is overboard and interfering with her life, but she can't deal with the anxiety of not doing them. Again, we just wanted to put out there to you guys, what is the difference between the quote unquote neat freak that Sarah considers herself to be and the quote unquote neat freak that Sophia lives with as a person with OCD?
I think what's interesting, well, what first caught my eye at least was that Sarah considers herself a neat freak, whereas Sophia's called a neat freak by her coworkers, which also made that huge differentiation of what Ali said, whereas Sarah kind of finds satisfaction in like color coding her pens and stuff like that, whereas Sophia may get anxiety from specific tasks. Um, but yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
oh, you're good. I was just saying that really stood out between the two examples.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. That was something we wanted to get across. And that kind of segues into our last slide, which is about the misconceptions and stigmas surrounding OCD. Um, so, obviously, one thing that we've kind of touched on throughout this presentation is the misrepresentation of OCD in our popular culture. Um, Oftentimes, OCD might be seen as being a clean freak or a neat freak or a perfectionist, but OCD is more than just obsessions and compulsions relating to organization and contamination or cleanliness. There are also obsessions and compulsions, obviously, about physical harm, familial harm. Um, there are unwanted sexual obsessions and compulsions, and aggressive obsessions and compulsions, as well as several others. Repetition and habitual behavior is not OCD. Um, One example we talked about as a resource team is the fact that I think Ali was saying this, the fact that maybe you put your coffee cup in one place one day and you knocked it over, and now you only put your coffee cup in another place where you don't knock it over, is not OCD. That's really just learning.
Yeah, like learning like a life lesson. Yeah, we were like thinking of
Yeah,
scenarios, and it was exactly what Zoe said. But no, like just because you need to have your coffee cup in this one specific spot, that was driven from a life lesson of you putting it in another spot and it got knocked over and may have ruined your day. And that's not that's not OCD. That's just good habits.
right. And obviously, there's a lot of misuse of the word OCD in a very similar sense. People will say, I'm so OCD, or I remember in probably the early 2010s when I was in middle school, it was very popular to say, I'm so OCD, I'm CDO, because it's in alphabetical order. But that is really demeaning and really diminishes the seriousness of OCD and the anxiety and stress and real like life interruption it causes to people struggling with clinical OCD. OCD isn't a personality trait and it isn't an identity. It's a disease and a disorder that can really ruin a person's life if they aren't able to seek adequate treatment. OCD is also something we would refer to as ego dystonic, which means that people with OCD know that their symptoms are irrational and they don't like having them and they don't want to have them. They don't think that, you know, it's rational to wash your hands 17 times or to have to start over in the shower if you touch the wall or to need something to be just right, like cracking an egg or walking through a doorway. But they can't help but do it because otherwise, if they don't, they just can't possibly deal with the anxiety and stress that that would cause them. And finally, everyone does not have, quote unquote, a little OCD. OCD is a clinical disorder and it's not quirks or habits. And as Ali was talking about, and you know, that OCD in the way that a lot of people refer to it when they say I'm so OCD in a way that's kind of favorable, like organization and perfectionism and color coding and stuff like that. That one big distinction is that people who do those things who don't have OCD, organizing themselves like that or doing those tasks brings them satisfaction, as we were saying, and makes them happy. And they do those things to feel good. But people with OCD, they carry out their compulsions so that they don't feel awful and so that they don't feel like they're going to die or they're going to catch a disease or their family members are going to be in danger or anything like that. And there's a huge difference there. And it's really important that we recognize our language and how we frame mental illness and OCD in our minds and in our conversations. Um, and that's just something we wanted to highlight as a team. And of course, as always, these resources that we've used for our presentation and our research are all available on our website and in the description of the YouTube video when it gets posted. Thanks, everyone.